threats have to be taken seriously. And sometimes people can say, oh, well, you're taking it too seriously, you're overreacting. But again, that's what I'm saying about this tendency of some people to say, oh, you're alarmist. Well, it's always too much precaution until it was too little. And the day it was too little, you wish you'd taken too much.
Welcome back to the J100 Podcast. I'm David M. Cohen. As we step into 2026, I wanted our first conversation of the new year to do something slightly different, to widen the lens, to shift geography, and to interrogate not just what's happening to Jews in Israel right now, but how societies are responding to it in real time. Today's guest is Jonathan Sacerdoti, a British journalist, broadcaster, and commentator, and one of the newest contributors to the Algemeiner. Jonathan has been writing and speaking for years about antisemitism, extremism, media responsibility, and the slow erosion of moral clarity in Western institutions. But over the past year, his work has taken on a new urgency and reached a much wider audience. Jonathan brings something different and increasingly essential to that conversation. He's looking at what's happening inside Western societies, particularly in Britain and Europe, where the battle lines are less about borders and armies and more about language, protest culture, policing, and the line between protected speech and real-world incitement. Jonathan is not interested in panic or performative outrage. He's interested in truth, intellectual honesty, and in whether liberal democracies still have the courage to defend themselves, morally as well as physically. I'm very glad to welcome him not only to the J100 Podcast, but to the Algemeiner as a new contributor. We anxiously anticipate his monthly contributions to the Algemeiner forest of content. And we're deeply proud to have Jonathan join us as a new columnist. This is Britain Now. Protests, policing, and the line between speech and incitement with Jonathan Sacerdoti. Let us begin. So let's give our audience a little bit of a background, just kind of who you are. I think people can hear your accent, but kind of your upbringing and your roots kind of before we fast forward to today, if you may.
Sure. Well, I'm a journalist and columnist based in the United Kingdom, as you can hear. I was born in London and have lived in London all of my life. I studied at Oxford University and I returned there about a year ago to do a debate at the Oxford Union, the world-famous debating society there, which brought quite a lot of attention my way as I was massively attacked, not physically, thank goodness, by a very, very hostile audience who had invited me there to talk about whether or not the state of Israel was an apartheid state carrying out a genocide. And that pushed me to some level of visibility online that, I'd been a journalist writing on these topics for many years, well over a decade, but suddenly I had a lot of attention from places I hadn't previously, like Instagram. 13 million people watched the video of me being abused at the Oxford Union there. And since then, I think there's been a lot of anti-Semitism rising around the world. And so the attention has kind of remained because that's a topic I've always written on and commentated on. But before that, I've been working for many years, as I said, as a journalist, both in broadcast and written. I've been the UK correspondent for I24 News, which many people know as the rolling news station from Israel for their English channel. I've reported on UK and Europe for many years. So for that, I traveled around quite a lot in the past when there were terrorist incidences, terrorist events, terrorist explosions, attacks around Europe. I covered them all from the ground as soon as they happened. Similarly, also in Israel, from terror attack in Tel Aviv. And that gave me, I think, something of a background for when October the 7th happened and a whole new audience discovered my work. I also write for the Spectator magazine here in the UK, which is the oldest continuously published magazine in English anywhere in the world. It's quite an establishment publication here.
How many years is it in existence?
That's a really good question. I don't remember the 18-something. It's been going since.
Over 100 years. Okay.
So it's and it's a great platform actually as well, because where the Algemeiner allows me to reach a predominantly Jewish audience, the Spectator kind of does the opposite. And it's always been a priority of mine that I never particularly wanted to be a Jewish journalist, capital J, but I'm also a proud Jew. And so it's always been within the material I write about quite a lot, sadly, has been antisemitism, among other Jewish and Israel-related topics. And as such, since October the 7th, it's been doubly important to me that I should be able to write and explore these ideas and thoughts and happenings with non-Jews, because I really see this as not a Jewish issue, even though it is Jews who are on the front line a lot of the time. The actual topic is really not just for Jews, and it can't just be solved by Jews. So I like very much to try to speak to as wide an audience as possible in that respect, and so that's really what I've been doing as well.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Why do you care so much about the topic of anti-Semitism? What is it in your background that makes this a compelling beat? We wish it wasn't a beat, but as we talked about offline, it is, sadly, it is perpetuating, and it's not going away anytime soon. What is it uniquely about you and your experience and your upbringing that makes this something that you're passionate about?
Yeah, well, obviously the short and obvious answer is I'm a Jew, and I think it's every Jew's interest to think about the persecution or attacks that we suffer as a people. And yet many didn't and haven't for a long time. Quite a few more have since 2023, since the end of 2023. But you're right that I have made it a focus of a lot of my writing. And as I said, actually, I kind of resisted that in some ways because I didn't want it to necessarily be that way. But if I'm to try and think why, I guess I'm that kind of person. I hate to see injustice, and I like to explore why that's happening. But also from my own personal history, my late father, who died about 6 years ago now, was a Holocaust survivor. He was a child in Italy. So my surname Sacerdoti is Italian. It actually means Cohen. It just means priest.
Oh, that's nice. Okay,
there you go. So a lot of
David Sacerdoti. I love that.
Well, there you go. Because Italian Jews have been in Italy since Second Temple times, a lot of names like that are actually Italian for generations. So that's my father's background, and he was 5 years old. His father was a rabbi in Florence, and was smart enough, had enough foresight to put his 5-year-old and 3-year-old sons in a convent to hide, to be hidden. And then a couple of weeks after he did that, the SS and the Nazis were raiding the convents, and he heard about it. So he went down there to warn them, and they were evacuated from there to a Catholic orphanage in the countryside nearby in Tuscany, where they spent 9 months. So my father, who was 5, and his younger brother, who was 3, in secret. Only the Mother Superior of the convent had known, and very few people knew in the orphanage that they weren't just ordinary Catholic orphans. And my father was left with instructions from his father. The 2 instructions that he was given were, say the Shema every night silently in your head, and don't let anyone see you naked, because they would see that he was circumcised.
Wow.
And that was the advice he was left with from his parents. I remember asking him when I interviewed him about his experience, did you have any sense of whether that was advice for the next few weeks or months or for life? And he's like, who knows? I was 5, and who knew if we would see each other again? Thank God they did. They were reunited after the war. But I think that has given me a very sharp focus on these sorts of things. And I think as a result of that, I used to talk a lot with my father about the news and about what was going on in the world. And I think it gave me a focus on these things. So in some ways, I was ahead of many people's curve. I've been writing about extremism, about Islam, about anti-Semitism, about Israel, even about the warped media coverage of Israel for many, many years. But there obviously was a bit of a change on October the 7th. And predominantly for me, that change was in how people received my work and how people treated me. So a lot of Jewish people I knew thought I was a bit extreme or over the top in the past, or alarmist was something I got told I was quite a few times by more establishment Jewish figures or organizations here in the UK. They don't say that so much anymore. And I don't say that to, pat myself on the back or blow my own trumpet. In fact, I just wish I'd been a bit better at it, that maybe we could have avoided some of it, though I'm not sure it was there for us to avoid. It's not really of our doing, is it?
Oh, no, it's a great segue to a lot of the questions I want to ask you. One last question before we pivot, and that is, did you always want to be a journalist? When did you kind of decide this was going to be the career path?
I was really interested in journalism as a child. I used to write for a children's newspaper back in those days that they had here in the UK. And then I went on and worked in a school newspaper at my high school, which won an award from the Daily Telegraph as the school newspaper of the year. And so I got an opportunity to write for the Telegraph then as a 17-year-old. And I guess you could say I was interested in journalism, but actually after university, after I studied in Oxford, I didn't go straight into journalism. I went into television production, and I made programs, mostly entertainment, also some factual programs and what they call factual entertainment, which is kind of a hybrid, including reality shows and things like that in the early days of reality TV. But I didn't stay there for that long. I did a few years in different independent production companies, but I think really the pull of serious news was always there. And as I think the world has been kind of slowly sliding down this precipice, let's say, I just transitioned to doing what I considered to be more serious and urgent work in terms of journalism, and that's how we got to where we are now.
Fascinating. Very, very interesting. I've had minimal exposure to the UK community, which means I've traveled there on a number of occasions, have some friends and family, went to Wimbledon once, even one summer. But I did always have that impression that I guess British jury was a bit more, we'll say, moderate or tempered, or tried the very best to kind of hold on to some sort of balanced perspectives towards Israel, what I would call maybe a more liberal perspective than a more conservative perspective. If I heard you correctly, it wasn't that when you was describing people as seeing you as alarmist, maybe what I understood you to be saying is like, that wasn't like really the approach of like UK jury so much pre-October 7th, but post that critical historical juncture now, that's changed. Did I understand that correctly on some level?
It's hard to say because I think we all of us have an idea of what different diaspora Jewish communities are like from those that we're in. So, as a British Jew, I've often looked at American Jewry and had kind of, I'm sure, a half-baked idea in some respects of what it is. So I always recognized in the US, obviously, very big Jewish population compared to other parts of the world other than Israel. But I always had this perception, for example, of the more progressive or liberal or reform Judaism, as I would call it. And I know we have different vocab for the different branches as well. I've always kind of looked at them with some level of confusion or I was slightly mystified by them, because I felt that for a long time there was this kind of, let's say, Democrat Judaism, which went under the banner of Tikkun Olam, and the Tikkun Olam really, as far as I'd always learned about it, wasn't just like US social justice politics. It meant something quite different, I felt, traditionally in Judaism, but it appeared to me to have become that in American Jewish thought. And so I suppose that might be a massive misrepresentation of how American Jewry is, in the same way that you might not fully get here. But my perception of British Jewry is complex, and we're all different. There isn't, I always bristle at the idea of the Jewish community, because there isn't a Jewish community. In one respect, there's a community of Jews across the world. We are in respect a family, a community, but in real terms, even within the UK, where there's something like 250 to 300,000 Jews, around 0.5% of the British population, we're way more than one community. I grew up in an Orthodox Sephardi community, so the Spanish and Portuguese Jews congregation in London, actually the oldest Jewish community in the UK, because they were the Jews who returned after Cromwell allowed Jews back in and formed this community, and they came from the Netherlands, but they were Spanish and Portuguese Jews. So when my father moved to the UK from Italy, when he married my mother, they chose the Spanish and Portuguese as kind of the closest minchag to Italian Jewry. And Italian is somewhat different again, because it's not really Ashkenazi or Sephardi. It has its own Minhag, but it's closest to this. So anyway, I think that the British jury tag is quite hard to define, but I do think that for many years there's been a sort of gap between what you might call the establishment British Jewish community and the rest of us. So a few years back, a lot of grassroots groups started popping up that weren't necessarily under the umbrellas of the traditional organized Jewish community activity here. The Board of Deputies, which again was started by the Spanish and Portuguese, Sir Moses Montefiore, I think, started it, and the other bodies that you might represent like brand name Jewish institutions here. And I think that was because of a feeling that maybe these organizations had become very establishment, and there wasn't necessarily an urgency about how they dealt with things like anti-Semitism or anti-Israel hatred and where the two intersect. So I think that it's complex, as with many things to do with Jewish identity.
Talk to me, as you mentioned earlier, about speaking in the Oxford Union, and that kind of, on some level, amplified your voice, maybe even unexpectedly. I can't imagine going into the lion's den like that. Like, what kind of forethought goes into accepting such an invitation? Trepidation? Do you think, hey, I'm not going to do this? Like, I've seen Ben Shapiro, I think do it a few times. I've seen videos. It looks, I don't know, it looks quite unpleasant. So I'm curious what your thought processes were on that.
Primarily, it's worth saying I'm not afraid of debate. In fact, I quite like it. And I also think it's quite important. So despite having, a very fine education from Oxford and before that from St. Paul's School, which again was the oldest public school in Britain, which is effectively a private school, not a public school, but that's what we call them. And I had great opportunities growing up thanks to those places. But I've always said the thing that I learned most from, or maybe was most useful to me in my day-to-day life as an adult, was something I did as an extracurricular activity, and that was debating. So the format of debating in that formal way, 2 opposition speakers or 4 opposition speakers, and the same on the other side, over a motion to try and understand a topic, was completely familiar to me. So I wasn't in any way afraid of that as a concept. I'm also not afraid of disagreement. I often represent views which people are passionately and emotionally set against, partly because I've talked about Israel and Jews a lot. And sadly, that seems to be the way those things go. And also I had background and have background in television and as a broadcaster. So really none of that was scary to me. I was afraid perhaps of violence, actually, if I'm honest. I mean, we took advice and ended up bringing bodyguards with us, which was something I don't normally have to do.
To me, that's just, it's an anathema. That's wild. Like, that you have to bring bodyguards to do this.
Yeah, I mean, for sure it is. And but that's the world we live in. So, and I don't, thank goodness, I don't think we were ever on that page, but we've seen what happened with the killing of Charlie Kirk and things like that. The threats have to be taken seriously, and sometimes people can say, "Oh, well, you're taking it too seriously. You're overreacting." But again, that's what I'm saying about this tendency of some people to say, "Oh, you're alarmist." Well, it's always too much precaution until it was too little. And the day it was too little, you wish you'd taken too much. So the fact is, for many, many years, we've always said it, that we have such high security around our synagogues. We have gates and guards and cameras and, automatic locking systems and things like that. And then one day, some guy drives a car into your synagogue and starts shooting people, as happened in Manchester. And none of it was too much. In fact, it was too little. So I think that when it comes to things like the debate, yeah, I take advice where I think it's a high-profile event and where I think there might be reason to think about it. And then I listen to the advice I'm given by professionals. So I do what they say. So in that respect, even then I wasn't afraid, because I take the precautions that I see to be necessary. And as for the debate itself, I remember going there. There was a lot of toing and froing before the debate, and I've talked about it before and written about it, but just to sort of give a brief recap, they really messed us about with the other people they're inviting. The whole thing seemed to me to be set to be a sabotaged kind of hijack before the event. The guy, the student who was elected to be the president of the society that term, was very proudly declared to be the first Arab president of the Oxford Union in its history. He had made a point of prioritizing debates like the one he invited me to, but then he also made a point of trying to sabotage them. So he invited Norman Finkelstein on the other side, and he invited a set of really quite dreadful people, I think, on the other side. And that's not because I disagree with them. I could have had a very engaging, interesting, and valid debate with 4 people. I could have helped him find 4 great speakers on the other side who I could have had a respectful conversation with. And maybe, maybe we all would have learned something, but that wasn't ever what was planned as far as I could see. And so in the end, we kind of helped them, let's say, to pick replacements on our side after a couple of cancellations. And we ended up adding primarily, I think, the person that made the biggest difference was Mossab Hassan Youssef, the Green Prince, the son of Hamas, as many people know him. And Mossab agreed to come because he wanted to debate Norman Finkelstein. Norman Finkelstein then cancelled when he heard that Mossab was coming because he didn't want to debate Mossab. So all of these kind of, silly comings and goings. But as it happened, I was amazed at how nervous Mossab seemed going into it when we met that day, and how hostile the reaction was to him. And I think that's when I realized, okay, you know what? I've been to this university. I've been in this debating chamber. I know debating. I'm British. There's a reason a lot of this isn't unsettling for me. It's because I'm kind of on my home turf. I'm in my natural habitat here. And so what I said to them all on the way up there in our car was, I said, guys, if you're nervous, just remember this is a room full of kids in expensive tuxedos, and that's it. Like, that you don't need to be afraid. You've come here to make a case, to make an argument, to have a debate, and let's just do that. And it's not like they needed my advice. These were 3 other, highly skilled people talking about this topic. And I think that while we lost the debate in numbers, and while there was this massive kind of riot, I do think we came away having shared a lot of information and facts and thoughts that, even if people in the room didn't take them on board, the world got to see afterwards, because these things live a second life online.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to ask you, meaning I would imagine the strategy is less about convincing people in the room, which might be almost impossible, as much as it is the amplification, impact, and the hope that the balanced, even-minded people will be subject and exposed to your arguments, right? That's really the strategy, right?
Yeah, I mean, I as I said, I'm not scared of discussing big ideas. That's kind of the whole point of what I do and what many of us do. So I was perfectly happy, by the way, to talk to those people in that room. And that was, I think, why my speech went viral, actually, is because I made a point of saying, you may not like what I'm telling you. You may not agree with what I'm telling you. You may not like me. This is a very emotional subject for many of you. And it's something that I feel you're probably primed to have a contrary opinion to mine. But I'm appealing to your open-mindedness, your intelligence. You're at the best university in the world. You are apparently among the elite of the elite in terms of your intellect and abilities. So just listen. You don't need to like me. Just listen and take it in. I think what was disappointing was that there was no intention among many of them to listen. They literally ground proceedings to a halt by screaming offensive abuse at me and the others. So they stopped the debate many times over. So I was very happy to address a room full of people who didn't agree with me. Actually, it wasn't all for the YouTube. That was their choice. They made it all for the YouTube, and then they hid the YouTube as long as they could. Thank goodness. By the way, it's the other thing. I had my phone with me on the lectern, and I'd set it to record the audio because a couple of people I had wanted to be able to be there couldn't. And only because I had that audio did the whole thing get released. They stalled and stalled at releasing the video. Then when they did, they edited it and tweaked it so that you couldn't see the abuse and how they behaved. And so I put it all together and put the audio back on. I released Mossab's speech straight away. I released my speech. It pushed them into releasing it. So even that, I felt they were remarkably dishonest and disingenuous about it.
Just out of curiosity, what's the most compelling counter narrative or counter question that you find when you're debating, that you find I don't know if you use the word compelling, but you find there's something to it. If there's any question that comes from, quote unquote, the other side that you struggle with, what might that be?
On the topic of Israel, you mean?
Yeah.
That's a very interesting question. I suppose the way I'd answer that is by saying that for a lot of people, this is very tribal, and that's on both sides. So I think a lot of people treat it a bit like a football team, and they like to think that their team is the best, and their team must win, and that's that. And obviously, that's a simplification, but I think that it's a simplification that describes a simplification of thought on their parts. So if I'm to look for the ways in which people of my opinion might behave that way, there are certainly plenty I could point to the other way around. But if you're asking me, where do I think I might be wrong, which might be the weakest point of asking somebody that enjoys debate. That's not something you're meant to do. But I'll say, I think sometimes there's a tribalism, and sometimes there's an utter reluctance to acknowledge shortcomings or errors. And so I've never claimed that everything the state of Israel or Jewish people did was perfect or faultless. In fact, I've always tried to explain the complexities of the things I talk about in terms of often having only a kind of range of options for action that are all less than optimum. So you might have a bad idea and a terrible idea, or something horrible and something worse, and you have to choose because that. And so I think that's often explains the position of Israel in terms of how it reacts or behaves to certain things. October the 7th, prime example. What do you do? Over 200 hostages, over 1,000 slaughtered. Those hostages are now held in the very territory that you need to try and defeat the enemy. You have to try and recover the hostages. You have to try and defeat the enemy. You also have to try and restore deterrence that allowed that to happen. And you have to remove the threat as much as possible from the future, all at the same time. Well, that's obviously not possible because each one impedes your ability to do the other. So along that way, you are bound to do things which are a judgment call. And in some people's judgment, you will have made the wrong call. And I'm perfectly happy when I hear people with a different opinion to mine express that. Say, I think this was the wrong judgment. For example, I think that Israel's appetite for civilian death was incorrect, despite its own attempts to make a legal case for each target. I can have that debate with people. I'm not sure I agree with them, but I would have that debate. It can be a compelling argument. I would say from the data I have and the knowledge I have and the people I've met and the places I've been, I'd say they're wrong, but I would have that debate and that argument. And that's the point about these debates you see today happening on campus, is they're not debates. Even when they call themselves debates and they happen at debating societies, that wasn't what happened with us in the Oxford Union. It's not what happens anywhere. Nobody came there to debate that. The very thing that set them off, as somebody wrote about it in commentary, I think, after the Oxford Union thing, I hadn't quite noticed it until I read it. The thing I said that really set off the worst abuse, that ground the whole thing to a halt, wasn't an opinion. It was a fact. It was the statistical average of calories that had gone into the Gaza Strip every day in aid. And I compared it to the number of calories that the National Health Service of the United Kingdom says a man in the UK needs. And the average per head calories going into Gaza at that point was higher. Now, I never said that meant nobody in Gaza went without. I never said that it meant that they were not suffering. I just simply stated that fact. And that really caused a meltdown. And so to my mind, where debate happens is when you debate a fact, or you debate the information, or how one came to that calculation, or whether it really is valid. Does it mean anything that I said that when they could perhaps prove evidence of suffering elsewhere? But that wasn't what happened. What happened was abuse and disruption. And so ultimately, I think that there is plenty of ground for discussion, plenty of ground for listening to each other. And I always say as well, if I, in my work, try to make people think and try to present my analysis and my commentary, and I hope that people, not just people who already agree with me, but people who maybe don't know, aren't sure, or even disagree with me, will take it on board. I have to offer them the same intellectual courtesy of saying, I will listen to and read what you have to say if I disagree with it, especially, and I will test my ideas against it. I think there is no bigger critic in my life of my thoughts and ideas and analysis than myself. I frequently check with myself if I'm wrong. I frequently try to dissect my own thoughts and arguments so that they are better informed, and if they're wrong, I want to change them. So I think that's vital, and that's something that I really feel has been lost in a lot of places where it's very urgently needs restoring. One of them is, as I said, campuses and universities. The other is in the media. The third would be in the new media online, where I also operate a lot. I have a podcast series in which I interview deep thinkers for hour-longs, a bit like this, but the other way around. And I just think it's so important to hear somebody for an hour who thinks and knows and has expertise that you even might disagree with. There is no better way of checking looking for truth, searching for truth. So I definitely think that we should listen to each other and hear opposite or opposing opinions or challenges and then integrate them into how we think.
I agree with you. I mean, I 100% agree with you. I think that the difference often is what's motivating a person, right? Is a person motivated by a search for truth, or is a person motivated by some agenda or communicating an idea, whether or not it actually, meets the factual rigor and analysis. So that's a very fair point. Thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit about UK right now, Europe as a whole. Kind of how bad is the anti-Semitism in reality? Right? Has it exponentially increased post October 7th? Is it something that's just always been there beneath the surface, or not even beneath the surface, but just kind of we're just more cognizant of it now, we're more conscious of it now, or is it a whole new game? Like what's from your perspective, like in the current time, in this milieu, how bad really is it?
It's hard to measure how bad anti-Semitism is, I think, because I don't think it's not like a pH that you can just dip something in and check the color. And in trying to measure it, I think we look at a lot of different bits of data, but above all, data isn't actually what matters. What matters is how we feel as Jews. Certainly, I would say anecdotally, but also looking at various pollings, all of which could be imperfect, there is a sense among more and more Jewish people that things are worse. So that's perhaps the easiest answer. And then you need to ask yourself, well, are they actually worse, and why are they worse? So those then trickle down to more granular dissection of the problem. And are they worse? Yeah, they are. I mean, 2 Jews being killed on Yom Kippur in a synagogue is actually it's new. I mean, I hate to express it this way. After 15 were killed on Bondi Beach in Australia, 2 doesn't seem so bad, huh? But of course it seems so bad. And I think the whole point is that it's new territory. And on the other hand, it's not new territory, because as soon as it happened, I don't think I met a single Jew who hasn't said, well, we knew it would happen, we just didn't know when. Now, that's true. I was reminded of an interview I did on Sky News after the attacks at the Hypercacher supermarket in France years ago. And I rewatched the interview I did, in which I expressed exactly that thought, which is, this isn't surprising that a kosher supermarket on a Friday afternoon has been attacked. Of course, it's not surprising. They've been killing Jews in France and across Europe actually for quite some time. And Islamist terrorism has been rising for ages, and we've been telling you about it. And then you call us alarmist. So somebody sent me the other day a clip I did on ITV News here on Good Morning Britain, like the main morning TV show here. At one point, I remember it actually, because they like to make it visual. They drove me out like 6 a.m. in the morning to be interviewed outside a synagogue. So there we were in the dark outside a synagogue in the cold on a London street. What was I talking about? I said synagogues should have armed police outside them. And again, I remember the few calls I got saying, I can't believe you said that. It's ridiculous. Why are you saying that? You're alarming people. You're making people scared. Well, maybe synagogues should have had armed police outside them. Maybe. I'm not the person that made it a necessity. I'm the person that reflected this necessity to Jewish and non-Jewish people. And for that, I often get flack. That's fine. I don't care.
You're describing, you're descriptive. You're pointing out a reality that you feel is a reality on the ground. People don't want to necessarily hear it, but that's the reality.
Right. And now we go to, I was doing the public candle lighting the other day for Hanukkah, and quite a few people said, why, there aren't enough police around here on the street with us. There were 2 police officers, unarmed in our country, by the way, predominantly. So things have changed. So in that respect, I can say, yeah, things have got worse. And then, the obvious, the BBC, Sky News, many of the newspapers, much of the online discourse, the propaganda that's pumped out daily about Israel has a direct knock-on effect on Jews. Then we see things like at the Glastonbury Festival, that performer Pascal Foster Robinson chanting death to the IDF and telling what to me, in my judgment, was a very anti-Semitic story about a former boss of his. That just in the last few days, the police decided there was not enough evidence that a crime had been committed and it was going no further. Maybe a crime wasn't committed. I don't know. Simply put, though, that was broadcast on the BBC. The BBC itself apologized for it eventually, along with a whole range of other nonsenses they've been engaged in over the last couple of years. These things are more and more common, and they're non-measurable, they're anecdotal. But as people are aware of them happening all the time, more and more Jewish people think, well, life is not so great as we thought here. And you then put that alongside what many of us experience, which is actually our lives are pretty nice. I'm extremely lucky and grateful to be a Briton. I feel every day grateful for everything I have. I live in a country which predominantly gives me everything I need. My day-to-day life is great. I like my neighborhood. I like I like the weather here, weirdly. There's lots I like about Britain as a human, as a Jew. And yet, there's an awful lot that I know is just around the corner or could go wrong, or if it goes wrong, the reaction won't be correct, or the government won't deal with properly, or the police are already not dealing with properly, whether it's protests or broadcasts or abuse in the street or chants at protests, and whether they are technically hate speech or technically anti-Semitic or technically protected by freedom of speech. It's a whole live debate. So you can only really go on a general feeling. And I think the general feeling amongst most Jews is, it's way worse than it ever was.
Say, if sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Or, there was a song once, if looks could kill, or if words could kill. Like, it sounds like you're saying that words can kill, in essence. Do you agree with that?
So, on the one hand, I want to be a fierce protector of free speech. And I know that is very important to Britain, as it is to America. And on the other hand, I recognize that certain regularization of abusive speech about Jews, say, will lead to abusive actions. And I think that we have obviously got limits to freedom of speech in our country and in yours already. The law already does limit certain things you can't say in certain places. It's that old thing about shouting fire in a packed theatre.
Right.
So I'm not a lawyer. I'm not here to explain how shouting that at the Glastonbury Festival or shouting a particular chant in a protest is or isn't illegal. That's not my job. But I certainly can look at the situation and say, well, when you've been calling to globalize the Intifada for 2 years on our streets, it's not really surprising if some people take it on themselves to globalize the Intifada and kill Jews. And I know what the Intifadas were. I saw them. They were the slaughter of Jewish civilians in Israel, and non-Jewish, by the way. But they were deliberate terrorist slaughter of human lives. And ultimately, that's when I say this isn't a Jewish issue. The 2 guys who were just found guilty in Manchester of planning what they are saying could have been the worst terror attack in Britain, the worst mass shooting. They were two men and one of their brothers who was also found guilty of not reporting them information that could have been useful. They said they planned to shoot a lot of Jews, but paraphrasing here, if they shot or killed Christians along the way, it would be a bonus. My point here is this is a threat to everyone. And
right. That's what Douglas Murray famously said that first they come for the Jews, but then they come for everybody else.
And the shooting in the synagogue in Manchester that did happen on Yom Kippur.
Right.
This isn't how it starts. That's the point. That's I think what I'm trying to say is, the Holocaust didn't start with the gas chambers, and there is something quite important about observing the society around you. So if you're only really safe as a Jew in the society around you, if you keep your head down, or you keep quiet, or you wear your Magen David inside your clothes, or you don't wear it at all, or you put your mezuzah on the inside of your door.
Right. Or the synagogues in Golders Green, you don't know any of them are synagogues because they're...
Yeah. Or if you do know it's a synagogue, it's surrounded with razor wire and cameras and guards. So I would say you're not really very safe there, actually. And when the police then take that one step further, which is to say this protest is entirely lawful, but Jews shouldn't really come near it, or this protest is entirely reasonable, but we've covered over a Holocaust memorial that's near its path, it makes you wonder how anyone can believe that there was nothing wrong with that protest, or that the climate is okay for Jews, because you're kind of protecting against the symptoms rather than protecting against the sickness, against the disease, against the cause. And if you don't tackle that disease properly, you're just applying anesthetic. You're not applying or administering a cure. And as a society, we need to administer the cure. And sometimes that's painful, and sometimes it's difficult to go through. But that's the process that we need to go through. And I think that British society, but others as well that I'm less connected to, are starting to realize that. It's just very slow, very late.
What does that look like? What does that look like? I mean,
I think when it comes, so exactly the things I've mentioned, only now are they deciding that globalize the Intifada might be an actionable thing for the police to deal with in a protest. Well, that could have happened 2 years ago, but great, let's start it now. There's an ancient Chinese proverb that I just made up that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, but the second best time is today. So let's plant the trees. Let's get on with it. So if there's hate preaching, or if there's anti-Semitic incitement going on inside mosques, prosecute it. It's going to be really ugly when you do. You might get some backlash, but go for it. There have been videos on British TV shortly after October the 7th showing preaching inside mosques that was anti-Semitic, calling for the death of Jews. And as far as I'm aware, nothing was done about that legally. Nobody is in jail for that. So I think that's what I'm describing. I think dealing with an ideology that is attacking us and rotting us from within. And at the same time, I think there's a parallel need to build up a positive in its place, because I think that such ideologies thrive where there's a vacuum. And if we are as a society no longer proud of our own history and our own ethics and morals and ways of being and living, if we're so, in fact, embarrassed by them that we're constantly trying to apologize for them, hush them up, dilute them, then it's no surprise when other cultures and ideologies that don't have any such qualms enter and take hold. And I mean, Gad Saad said it. He said, we talk a lot about worrying that we're Islamophobic, but you never hear Islamic extremists or terrorists worrying that they're kufarophobic. And that's, I suppose, what I'm trying to say here is, of course, we don't want to be prejudice or discriminating against decent, honest, good Muslim people. Of course not. But at the same time, we can't throw that baby out with the bathwater and say, therefore, we must never discuss the problem of Islamic anti-Semitism, Islamic terrorism, Islamic theological ideas which make regular life in the West unsustainable in collaboration with tolerating those belief systems, we have to talk about all those things. So that's what I'm talking about. That is one of the cures. We also have to deal with the far left. I mean, we talk often in polite society about the threats from the far right. When the far right, of course, there are threats from the far right. And I think we're beginning to experience those a lot in online far right discourse, particularly in the States. But the threat from the far left is far more manifest, far bigger, I would say. And it's been for years developing and building. And so we have to be willing to criticize and deal with that as well, not instead. That's my point. I'm not trying to make this a tribal thing myself. We have to deal with all of these things, but we really need to hurry up.
Right. That's a great ending to that little bit of a soliloquy there. That's exactly right. We have to hurry up. I would agree. I agree with that 100%. We need to hurry up yesterday, and if not yesterday, then today. Are you optimistic about Jewish life in the UK and Europe at this juncture?
I find it such a difficult question because I suppose the answer is no. And I don't like that being the answer. I'm still here. And yet I'm thinking hard about whether I should be or how long I should still be here for. And I do say that more openly to other people now, that, we should as a community or as communities or as Jews, however you want to put it, be thinking of our options. So I do think that we could turn things around. And I say we meaning Britain, not we meaning Jews. I do think that we could improve this. We could deal with some of these problems. But I also don't know if it will be easy or go smoothly or if it will work. So if the chances of success are not great or at least not guaranteed, I know that Jews are often the first victims along the way. As Einat Wolf said to me when I spoke with her, she said Jews have a timing problem. We're often the first victims. Yeah. So society might right itself, but it might be too late for us. So that's one of the things that worries me when you say, am I optimistic for Jewish life in Great Britain? And yeah, I also think that there is a huge groundswell of support for, well, I know there is for I write and say. I get an enormous amount of feedback from people I don't know, many in the UK, many not Jewish, who agree, both in public and in private. They will make a point of expressing this. So we often hear talk about a silent majority and things like that. I can't measure if they're a majority or not. Their silence is very frustrating, but very understandable. I just mean to say there could be a tipping point, at which point things might change. That in itself is scary because the agents of change might be just as scary or difficult for us to deal with as Jews or as Britons, and they may not work. So that's why I find it hard to be totally optimistic. But I'm generally, despite everything, despite all appearances to the contrary, I consider myself a realistic optimist because I never give up on hope. I wouldn't do what I do if I didn't think there was a point to it. I don't just want to be a doom monger. I don't just want to have been right. I want to have helped.
You believe that you can genuinely persuade and win over, right? I think that's
yeah, and also help people work things out, rather than to make it as dialectic or sort of combative as persuade and win and defeat. I just want people to work this out with me, and I like to think I might be able to play a small part in there, working it out and thinking, and some of it I might be wrong on, some of it I might be right on, but I do definitely think that there is a shift that's needed, and it may yet come. Thank God, Jews have other options, and the primary one is the state of Israel, which again is not statistically a safer place for me to live as a Jew in terms of my likelihood of being killed. I think I'm probably individually at far more risk in the state of Israel of being killed specifically for being Jewish or by terrorism than in the UK. But I think many Jews consider it to be a psychologically safer place because of its ethos and understanding and willingness to fight those battles, despite the massive, swell of opinion against it and all of that. I think the idea is basically, to put it very bluntly, it knows it's in the war already and it's fighting. Britain just seems to be kind of waking up to being in that war and figuring out what the battle plan might be.
Right. No, it's well said. And as we're going to wind down our conversation here with another question or two, and I see that we're going to need to have some subsequent conversations, and maybe even we'll have some brief conversations around your upcoming articles, maybe to amplify as well. I know you have limited time, but we'll do the best we can. But I'm curious, and I know you're not based in the United States. You are going to hopefully be a more frequent visitor in the coming year, 2026. But I am curious, just from afar, what your perspectives are on what's going on in America vis-a-vis what's going on in Europe. Is the United States genuinely, authentically different? Is it a different type of diaspora? Is it not? Kind of what are some of your perspectives on that?
So I will start again by reiterating I'm definitely not as familiar with the States as I am with the UK, so I don't want to offend anyone with any inaccuracies or generalizations. I do see differences for sure, and I see differences in, I mean, you know, we replaced 14 years of a predominantly right-of-centre government with a left-wing one now. And I think I've read, again, I'd like to check it before I put my name on it, but I think the vast majority of people here are dissatisfied with the government and the Prime Minister, even those who voted for them. So I think we turned left when you turned right, not out of conviction in those policies, but out of wanting a change. And unfortunately, that change isn't necessarily to everyone's taste or everyone's benefit. Now, in the States, I do think the Trump phenomenon is very interesting. I certainly think that you don't need me to explain why Donald Trump might not be to everyone's taste and why it might seem in the grand sweep of history a really peculiar thing that he is the president of the US, or that someone with that personality is the president of the US. However, in many respects, thank goodness, he is the president of the US. Now, some people I've potentially just alienated a huge swathe of people watching by saying that, but so be it. I wish that as I did an interview that just came out with Dan Shiftan in Israel, he said, "Isn't it strange that all of America only had to offer a choice between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump?" I think that is quite true, but that's true in lots of political systems. I mean, we didn't exactly have the finest choice here in our last election. So I think you're getting a lot of things right. You're righting a lot of wrongs. As I said, sometimes the process for doing that is difficult, scary, shocking. I think that's what's happening under Trump. And yet I do think, his attitude towards Israel, an area I deal with, thank goodness for it. Thank goodness he couldn't have come a day too soon after Biden, who was relatively supportive in a impractical, bumbling, kind of borderline senile way, under the influence of a vast number of people who weren't supportive. Similarly, I don't think everything Trump...
the last of the Zionists in the Democratic Party.
Right. But I'm not sure which... The last Zionist brain cell may have been alive or not, depending on what day it was and what drugs they gave him. So I think that even that was peculiar, from the outside, and I'm sure it was from the inside, to watch a president gradually retreat into some form of geriatric confusion was terrifying and scary. Right. And I don't say that to be horrible to the man. I feel very,
No, I'll even interject. I happen to have had the privilege of being in the White House just last week for the Hanukkah party. And I was standing as close to President Trump as I, at least historically, ever have and probably ever will. And I was taken by that he looked old to me. Like he clearly aged. Like, and what you see on TV is not what you see in person. And he's not a young man either. No. I mean,
listen. And if any job is bound to age you, I guess that's the one. You don't leave that job with more hair than you went into it. So, like, but
I was actually frightened. I have to be honest. I was standing there, and I actually was a little bit frightened, where my mind, for a minute, began to think, "What if something happened to President Trump, like happened to President Biden?" And like, it's not a comforting.
Well, and I think, that's a very good point. With age comes wisdom, but also with age often comes illness and slowness and whatever. So, I think that's a bigger discussion over what are the qualities that we prioritize in a leader. Is speed and agility actually as important as wisdom and experience? And there's a perfectly good case for saying, no, it's not. I'd rather have the guy with the grey hair or whatever. It's the people around him who need to be quick to react on his decision making and strategy. That's all fine. I just mean to say that looking at the US, I do think that for my tastes, Donald Trump is righting a lot of wrongs, especially when it comes to Jews in Israel. But on the other hand, you've got the election of Mamdani in New York, which I think is horrifying and terrifying, not just for Jewish people. I think the general weird popularity of sort of communist ideas among a younger generation is terrifying to me and scary. I've heard a lot of thinkers explain why they think it's happening, and I get that. But I think that as the beneficiaries of capitalism, as the beneficiaries of the freedoms we've enjoyed, as well as the beneficiaries of living in kind of post-Second World War Western society, we took a lot of stuff for granted. And it's very easy then when life is tough in one way or another, not to realize how good we have it in the broader historical perspective, which is not to say it's perfect. There may be things that can be improved or tweaked, but this wild swing to the other side, and then that we live in an age when any minor swing we make is amplified massively by algorithmic influence or nefarious players, whether it's China or Russia with disinformation. I mean, the fact that, I often comment that when scrolling through TikTok that it's extraordinary that I'm absorbing literally so much Chinese propaganda. There's literally weird influences on there from China that I'm experiencing that until TikTok I would never once have seen. They're quite fun, some of them. I'm a fan of Mr. Bao creating, his weird traditional dishes as much as the next guy. That's relatively harmless, but it doesn't take a genius to see that we're being manipulated in some respect. So I think, it's a very interesting time that we live in. We're very unaware of many of the things that are influencing our thought and our opinions. I think it's an age when we have to wake up. We have to be awakened to those influences. All of us need to get a bit smarter about how we make our minds up, how our decisions are made. We need to engage more with each other. We need to try and veer away from the extremes, which we are increasingly rewarded for going into. People get social kudos for being more tribal, more purist, more extreme. The algorithms and advertisers that rely on them push us more and more towards those extremes. There is, I think, that tide to be fought back. And I think your original question was about America. So let's just tie it back into that for the end of the answer, which is to say, America is doing that in some respects, but Donald Trump will only last so long, even if he does magically find a way to be president for an extra 4 years. As you said, he's not young. He has an enormous amount of energy as far as one can see, but he's not young. And even then, 4 years, 8 years, we don't know what comes next. And I think all of us are very, very aware of how easily things can swing one way or the other.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Very, very well said. Final question for today. I always like to ask my guests something interesting about you that the casual observer or even the more religious reader may not know about you. Something interesting, something out of the box. Could be personal, it could be professional, whatever you're comfortable sharing. Something about you that most people don't know that people would find interesting.
If most people don't know it, maybe I don't want to tell them. I'm trying to think. I try to think of a lot of what I do is a lot of my life. But actually, one thing that surprises some people about me is that I'm quite a creative person. I do a lot of ceramics, pottery. I throw pottery vessels, and I've done it for many years. And so if you eat in my home, you will eat off plates that I have made. Everything will be served in dishes that I have made. I've made kiddush cups and Shabbat candles and netilat yadayim jugs and a whole crockery set, many crockery sets, coffee cups, mugs. The house is basically heaving with ceramics. And so,
what is it about that resonates with you so deeply?
It's a great question as well. I've always enjoyed being a creative person. I am very much plugged into the arts and culture generally. It is another sideline that I sometimes get to write about, and maybe in a future world we'll get to write more about. and creativity and making things.
You should do a culture piece for the Algemeiner. We have a culture piece.
Pleasure. People I always get these emails every so often when I do like the odd opera review or something, like, what are you doing reviewing an opera or something like that? So I maybe I should do that more in the Algemeiner. But anyway, I love pottery. I find it very like centering, and I don't want to sound too pretentious about it, but it's something humans have done actually for many, many years. They've taken literally earth and formed things out of it, and the whole chemistry of it, firing them into these vitrified.
It's like a human being, right? The Torah says we are afar min ha'adama. We are formed basically from the dust of the earth. We come from the dust. We go back to dust. So you're tapping into that the earth.
And archaeologists do. You discover shards of pottery that tell you things about civilizations. It's literally something humans have done forever, and it's something amazing. And there's something very satisfying about creating something and all the process you have to go through. Unlike news, it's pretty slow. There are many stages. You have to throw things, dry them, carve them, fire them once, glaze them, fire them a second time. It's a very long and slow process where there's a lot of room for error and a lot of room for fortune, a lot of room for repetition and trying. I find it kind of like the Mother Earth grounding from the other stuff that I do. So I've never talked about that before. There's
always got to be something new. What we pride ourselves on at the Algemeiner is that I always tell people in conversation, I have many of them every day, you'll always find something in the Algemeiner that you won't find somewhere else. So similarly, and you're a prominent person, you are displayed on many platforms, but somebody who's going to listen to this, they should learn something about you that they won't learn anywhere else. So that's, we call it in Hebrew, Yotzei Zayin, or in Yiddish, right? Algemeiner has Yiddish roots. We fulfill that Algemeiner construct for this conversation. Jonathan, thank you so much for your time, for your insights, for your wisdom, for your erudition. It was really excellent going a little bit deeper, and I'm looking forward to continuing to deepen our connection personally and with the Algemeiner for the years to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you.